Freddy Krueger, the macabre brainchild of acclaimed screenwriter and director Wes Craven, is often cited as one of the most frightening villains in film history. Krueger attacked his victims while they were in their most vulnerable state, in their dreams. Surely, the notion of being tortured, seriously harmed, and even killed within the confines of your nightmares is nothing more than pure fiction. But what if it wasn't? From a traumatic childhood encounter to an unexplained mystery that claimed the lives of an alarmingly high number of healthy young men, this famous work of fiction horror has roots deeply embedded into reality. When he was only about 7 years of age, Wes Craven spent a typical evening at home. While his family slept, he found himself in the grasp of a moment that would haunt him for years to come. He recalled the experience during an interview about the making of A Nightmare on Elm Street, stating, "I was just about to fall asleep, and I heard this shuffling down the sidewalk and mumbling. I went to the window. I was in a second-story apartment where I lived with my family in Cleveland, and there was this man that looked pretty much like Freddy ended up looking. I assume now that he was probably a drunk. But he stopped, and he happened to look directly up into the window and right into my eyes. I don't know how he knew to stop, how he knew a kid was watching, but somehow he did, and it just stopped my breath in my throat." The man continued to stare at him for an unsettlingly long time. Even after young Wes retreated from the window for a minute or so to escape the confrontation, he returned to the man still leering when he looked out again. As the figure walked away, he kept his gaze fixed on young Wes, even as he moved toward the entrance of the Craven family's apartment building. Fortunately, he was never to be seen again. Although it turned out to be the end of the encounter, Wes frantically awoke his entire family, terrified that the person outside was coming for him. The man he described ultimately became the prototype for his movie villain, even wearing the character's signature fedora. Craven summarized the moment by saying, "That memory became the essence of Freddy, because that guy, whoever the hell he was, enjoyed scaring the shit out of a kid." That moment undoubtedly left a lasting scar on Wes, but it pales in comparison to the real-life horrors that inspired the premise for his movie. Sometime during the early 1980s, Wes noticed a pattern in a series of news articles published in the LA Times over the course of several months. To his dismay, the newspapers made no connection between the tragic stories despite their alarming similarities. He recalled that in each story, a healthy young man, typically of Southeast Asian descent, died in the middle of a nightmare. He described the third such article he came across as being the most descriptive and enthralling, offering a detailed account from his memory of it. This kid, he and his family had come out of the relocation camps in Southeast Asia, I think Cambodia. They were now in the United States living someplace in California. He had been troubled by severe nightmares, and they had increased in intensity to the point that he told his family, "These don't feel ordinary." His family had tried to console him and tell him, "We've come out of this terrible background. Nightmares are a normal part of your psyche trying to deal with that." But he increased in the sense of trying to say that this doesn't feel normal. It feels too real. Craven further recalled that the young man faked taking the sleeping pills he had been prescribed to fool his parents, and went so far as having a coffee pot hidden in his closet to keep him awake throughout the night. After several days, the sleep-deprived man fell asleep on the couch while watching television. Relieved that his son was finally getting some sleep, his father carried him off to bed. But only a short time later, his family heard screaming and thrashing. They rushed to his bedroom, only for him to fall dead on the floor before they could reach him. According to Wes's recollection, doctors found no heart failure and no other apparent reasons for his death. While there are no available sources to detail a story as cinematic as Craven described, the unexplained sleeping deaths were indeed very real. A rash of these came out during the late 1970s and through the 1980s. In fact, there was an article written by LA Times staff writer Bill Curry, printed on February 26, 1981. It was aptly titled Nightmare Syndrome, and it may well be the piece to which Craven alluded. It recounted the tragic story of Yong Leng Thao, a man who relocated to Portland, Oregon from a Laotian refugee camp in Thailand in the summer of 1980. His relocation gave him, his wife, and their 8 children a new chance at life after the horrifying experiences they endured in their home country during the Laotian Civil War. This newfound stability, however, would be short-lived. On an evening about 6 months after his coming to America, Young stayed up late watching television with his uncle. Shortly after he went to sleep, during the early hours of January 8, 1981, Young's breathing became labored. He gasped for air while his wife desperately attempted to shake him awake. At just 47 years old, with no history of illness, he passed away by her side. Medical examiner Dr. Larry V. Lumen found no cause of death despite rigorous post-mortem examinations. It was a heart-wrenching story on its own, but medical professionals across the United States began realizing it wasn't an isolated incident. For Dr. Lumen, it was already the second such case in Portland that he had seen in just 3 days. Both victims were Laotian refugees belonging to the Hmong ethnic group, who are indigenous to Southeastern Asia. Concerned there was a larger pattern, Dr. Lumen searched for similar cases. Eventually, he spoke with officials in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and discovered that their neighboring city of St. Paul had experienced 4 unexplained deaths that matched the details of his cases. All of them young men belonging to the Hmong ethnic group. And as more officials took notice, they found many more cases fitting the description. Completely perplexed by the mystery, the search for a cause went underway. Examinations of all the bodies continued to frustrate medical examiners, who stated there were no causes to be found. Results from autopsies ruled out accidental death, suicide, and foul play. Despite the mysterious affliction affecting young men, all signs pointed to death by natural causes. Desperate for an answer, medical professionals were unwilling to leave any stone unturned. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, began conducting an inquiry into the unknown illness, which would eventually become known as Sudden Unexpected Nocturnal Death Syndrome, or SUNS. They hypothesized that the cause of death must have been related to the heart, something like cardiac arrhythmia, but they couldn't pin down the exact cause due to the lack of evidence. Another notable element they found to be common among victims was that the deaths were often preceded by a loud groan or cry, some sources noting that the victims died in agony. This led to a disturbing possibility that the victims were possibly being frightened to death by their nightmares. A shocking revelation, to say the least. If it were true, how could it possibly affect only one ethnic group? Not to mention the fact that it seemed to be a recent phenomenon, dating back only a few years to about 1977, when the first victim passed away in his bed. However, if the Laotian Hmong did suffer nightmares at a higher rate than the rest of the population, it wouldn't be surprising considering the hell they endured during and after the Laotian Civil War, a conflict heavily intertwined with the Vietnam War. When the war began, Laos was home to as many as 400,000 Hmong people, whose traditional way of life faced a dire threat from the unfolding conflict. Residing in the mountainous regions of the country, the Hmong community was self-sufficient. They farmed food to meet their own needs and opium to earn income. With an enemy in common, the Laotian Hmong were recruited by the CIA to fight against the communist regime in what would become known as the Secret War. Defending their way of life, the Hmong fought bravely, but their fortitude came at a cost. Their soldiers lost their lives at a rate 10 times greater than their US counterpart, and they suffered losses to their civilian population to an even greater extent. Their villages, in areas which they had populated for 1,000 years, were bombed or burned to the ground, crops and livestock completely destroyed, their population decimated. Some estimates being as high as 50% of the Hmong population killed, both by attacks that occurred during the war and being massacred or succumbing to disease and starvation afterward. In February of 1973, the Vientiane Treaty was signed between the Kingdom of Laos and the Pathet Lao, establishing a ceasefire and mandating the withdrawal of US troops and the end of their air support. It also marked the end of US food drops that had been a lifeline for them. The Hmong of Laos became refugees in their own homeland. They were now viewed as traitors for collaborating with the United States and were declared enemies of the state. A fortunate few high-ranking military officials and their families were airlifted to relative safety in Thailand, but the majority of those who remained faced grim futures. Many were forcibly relocated to state-owned collective farms. Approximately 10,000 individuals, including police officers, civil servants, teachers, and those perceived as royal sympathizers or intellectuals, were sent to seminar camps, which were nothing more than forced labor camps that imposed mandatory political indoctrination onto their captives. Due to the dire conditions for the Hmong who were left behind after the war, most opted to flee to neighboring Thailand. They embarked on a long, dangerous journey on foot, crossing through dense jungle and over the strong and unpredictable currents of the Mekong River that separates the two countries. Many Hmong would not complete the trek. They succumbed to starvation, disease, exposure, and drowning. Those who made it to the refugee camps in Thailand, like the Ban Vinai camp on the border, endured squalid conditions, including overcrowding, lack of electricity and running water, and no functioning sewage system. Gradually, refugees started relocating to the United States. The United States initially admitted only the most highly educated, allowing roughly just 1,000 Hmong to enter after the war. This was followed by an influx of 11,000 more in May 1976, and by 1978, that number grew to 30,000. The newly resettled migrants embarked on a brighter path for their futures, free from the horrific realities of their war-torn homes. However, they now faced an entirely new set of challenges in a completely foreign land. They were confronted with significant cultural differences and language barriers that made integration difficult and led to a significant portion of the population living in poverty. Furthermore, despite being thousands of miles removed from their ancestral homes, they were haunted by what they left behind. According to the National Institutes of Health, about 71% of trauma victims with PTSD experience frequent nightmares, compared to only about 2 to 5% of the general population. Given the collective tragedy faced by Laotian refugees, it was reasonable to assume they were prone to suffering nightmares. But was it the cause of the mystery illness afflicting the Hmong people residing in the United States? Concerned citizens, especially those of Hmong ethnicity, were urgently seeking answers and began publicly speculating about potential causes. Hmong tribal leader and former Major General in the Royal Lao Army, Vang Pao, insisted that the deaths were almost certainly caused by the nerve gases that were used against them during their work with the CIA. However, this was quickly and widely dismissed by medical professionals. Portland's medical examiner, Dr. Lumen, responded by saying, "It just doesn't make sense to me. Nerve gas doesn't act this way. There's no evidence. Secondly, if it was nerve gas, why does it only affect males? And why only during the night? And if nerve gas doesn't affect people right away, if it takes 4 years, it's not very effective." A less conventional belief became common among the Hmong community. Some felt their ancestors were punishing them for leaving their homeland. According to Dr. Kataria associate professor at UC Berkeley, it was caused by the inability to do right by your ancestral spirits because you're not there, or because you don't have the right things to perform the right rituals. They attributed these deaths to Da Cho. In their culture, they believed the notorious evil spirit, Da Cho, suffocated victims in their sleep by squeezing the breath out of them. In fact, their very concept of a nightmare was vastly different from our modern understanding of them being simply bad dreams. They believed that they were nocturnal visits from evil beings. To many who believed this traditional understanding of their culture's spirits, they feared that while Da Cho was able to navigate the globe to haunt them in their new country, the spirits of their ancestors, who would typically protect them from such harmful beings, were not able to. Despite the panic and desperation, the only thing that remained clear was the fact that this disease seemed only to be affecting healthy young men, refugees of Southeastern Asian descent, primarily the Hmong. Between July 1977 and March 1982, there were at least 51 unexplained deaths across the United States that were attributed to sons. All except for one victim were males, with an average age of 33 years old. Putting into perspective the impact of the disease, Tom Prendergast, an epidemiologist from Orange County, California, was quoted as saying, "It was reported in Portland, for instance, that in 1 year there had been only 4 deaths among the Hmongs, and all 4 of them were unexplained." He also noted that 6 out of the 13 deaths in the Hmong population in Orange County were caused by suns. The disturbing trend continued for years. The apparent link to a cardiac issue during sleep led to medical professionals to begin exploring the idea that the cause was actually something in the dreams of victims, specifically night terrors. Night terrors are similar to nightmares in that they are unpleasant episodes that occur during sleep. However, they differ from nightmares in several key ways. They occur in the first stages of sleep rather than the deeper stages as nightmares do. Recall that often, the deaths of suns victims occurred shortly after going to bed. Symptoms of night terrors include vocalizations such as screaming or shouting, staring wide-eyed, inability to be awakened, sweating, labored breathing, and racing pulse. They can also trigger a severe autonomic discharge, which is to say, it sets off the fight or flight response in its victims. According to a 2018 article from the Journal of the American Heart Association, these symptoms could all be observed in suns victims before their deaths. At its peak, it was taking the lives of Southeast Asian refugees in the United States at a rate of 59 people out of 100,000. To underscore the magnitude of this rate of death, if it afflicted the entire population equally, it would have been the 4th leading cause of death in 1981, including only the Hmong population, who had a mortality rate as high as 92 per 100,000. It would have been the 3rd leading cause of death. Another reason it's thought that night terrors may have been a factor in suns during this period is the fact that deaths from this condition tapered off significantly toward the end of the 1980s. The Journal of the American Heart Association wrote, "Night terrors might be a reasonable explanation for the sharp decline of suns rate. Southeast Asian refugees at 1.5 years after migration had high levels of depression, anxiety, and hostility, which was similar to sufferers of adult night terrors. At 3.5 years after migration, all of these symptoms had improved, and so did the occurrence of suns. Victims discovered in night terrors are unarousable, and in the few successfully aroused patients, terrifying dreams were often experienced. Beyond the potential for night terrors playing a factor in causing suns deaths, research over the years uncovered more and more facts surrounding these cases. For example, victims have been found to have enlarged hearts and significantly increased heart weights, which could point to early stages of cardiomyopathy, a potentially deadly heart disease. Interestingly, it was also uncovered that these deaths weren't as isolated as initially thought. Instead, it was discovered to be a folk illness in several countries in Asia. A folk illness, also known as a culture-specific syndrome, is a disease that's typically only recognized within a specific culture or society. Although many Hmong insisted that these sleep deaths never occurred when they were home in Laos, history may tell a different story. The first recorded account of such a death was in the Philippines in 1917, 60 years before the first reported death in the United States. A newspaper article printed in July of 1983 pointed out this phenomenon. A deadly disease called bangungut attacks sleeping young men in the Philippines. There are no current statistics on bangungut deaths, but Filipinos believe it strikes those who go to sleep immediately after a heavy meal. Tradition has it that death is preceded by nightmares. Bangungut is a Tagalog word meaning to rise and moan in sleep. It's a disease that is said to have been known in the Philippines far before even the 1917 case. Reviews of autopsies and family questionnaires showed similar rates of suns-like deaths in Filipinos between the years of 1948 through 1982 and for the year 2003. 96% of those cases were males with an average age of 33 years old. In Thailand, they also have this phenomenon. They call it lai thai. Lai roughly translates to loud groan occurring during sleep, or a loud noise made while frightened, and Thai means death. The phrase, however, is understood to simply mean sleep death in Thailand. Just as it afflicted the Philippines, It has been long known as a pervasive disease in the Thai culture as well, particularly for a notably high number of migrant Thai workers in Singapore in 1990. Likewise, the phenomenon is known as Pakuri death syndrome in Japan, Pakuri meaning suddenly and unexpectedly. In 1983, it was said that each year, hundreds of apparently healthy young Japanese die suddenly in their sleep, sometimes with a gasp or shout, and doctors do not know why. Many cases of SUNS are now believed to be related to undiagnosed Brugada syndrome, which is a genetic disease that results in abnormal electrical activity within the heart, leading to an increased risk of sudden cardiac arrest. Symptoms of Brugada syndrome can include fainting, irregular heartbeats, and sudden cardiac arrest, often triggered by fever or resting. However, there is no proof that SUNS cases are a result of this illness. In fact, to this day, there is still no answer for what does cause sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome. Cases of refugees dying from this mystery sleep illness faded over the years and became relatively non-existent by the end of the 1980s. By that time, SUNS had claimed the lives of more than 100 Southeastern Asian refugees, mostly of Laotian Hmong, but individuals of Vietnamese and Cambodian descent were also counted among its victims. The mystery of SUNS, a condition so terrifying that Wes Craven's fictionalized interpretations of it would become one of the most frightening horror movies in history, serves as a stark reminder of the unexplained phenomena in our world that we simply do not understand. Just as this tragedy left experts without an explanation, other unexplained events continue to intrigue and confound us, like the story of the ghost blimp L8. Click here to watch my video about the US Navy airship that crashed into a neighborhood in San Francisco with the crew nowhere to be found. Thanks for watching. Until next time.